All right, we've started the 2024 schedule preview and prediction videos. We did Michigan first. Now we're doing the second team, the team that finished number 2 in the college football playoff rankings, the Washington Huskies. Now, Washington last year had kind of an out of nowhere good season. They had went 8-4 the previous year, and then the next year, 2023, second year under DeVore, they go 14-1 in total, make it into the college football playoff, only to lose in the championship round against the Michigan Wolverines, that being their only loss on the entire season. That's the good news for Washington. The bad news for Washington is that this year is going to be a major rebuilding year. They lose a bunch of talent on their roster, and the main person they lost is Michael Penix, the quarterback. All he did was contend for a Heisman Trophy. Yeah, it's going to hurt Washington a lot to lose a Heisman caliber quarterback like Michael Penix. On top of that, they lost a whole bunch of people in the transfer portal, as well as a great bit of talent to the NFL. But I think the biggest loss for Washington wasn't in who their players were. It was really more of their coach, Kalen DeBoer. We all know the story with that one. Nick Saban, 2 days after the national title game, announces he's retiring from Alabama. 2 days later, it's reported that Kalen DeBoer, who at the time was still a Washington head coach, had canceled a radio appearance at a nearby radio station. Turns out the reason why he canceled that appearance, he was going to Tuscaloosa. He interviewed, he got the job, and that night his plane landed in Tuscaloosa. He had the press conference, he agreed to the contract, and now he's going to coach Alabama in the 2024 college football season. On top of that, he brings a whole bunch of his coaching staff to Alabama. He's replaced with a guy who is kind of concerning. His name is Jeff Fisk. Now, Jeff Fisk, last year, he did do a lot of good things at Arizona. He led them to a 10-win season. Great. Outside of that 10-win season with Arizona, he has had a losing record in every season that he's coached. Maybe he is finally learning how to coach in college football, but if I'm a Washington fan, I'm not exactly impressed with Jeff Fisk and the university's decision to hire Jeff Fisk as their head coach. Anyway, that's enough talking about what Washington has lost from last year's season. Let's look at their schedule and try to predict how they are going to do this season. Now, the good news for Washington is that you open up with 2 consecutive cupcake games. You have FCS opponent Weber State. That should be an easy win for Washington there. And then you have Group of 5 opponent Eastern Michigan, who even by Group of 5 standards hasn't really been that good over the years. So you should get an easy win over Eastern Michigan. So that should give you a 2-0 start to start the season. Then you have what is technically listed as a home game for Washington, but is actually in the neutral side of Seattle, Washington. I'm talking about former Pac-12 rival and in-state rival Washington State. The thing that concerns me about Washington State is that all of the teams that were in the Pac-12 last year, 2 of them did not sign with a new conference. That is Washington State. So they don't have a conference this year. They're probably just going to end up staying as an independent for a while, then find another conference to go to. But the fact that they unlike the rest of the Pac-12, which includes some very dismal teams like Cal, that they ended up being one of the teams that did not sign with a conference, that could be a sign of things to come, sign of things wrong with Washington State, or maybe they just prefer to be an independent team like Notre Dame for a while. We don't know fully why they didn't sign with another conference. However, I do still think Washington should be able to get the win over Washington State, giving them a 3-0. That's it for the non-con schedule. The rest of the schedule for Washington is going to be the Big Ten schedule. I forgot to mention this earlier. Washington is going to make the jump this year. They were in the Pac-12 up until last year. They won the conference last year. Now they're going to what's called the Big Ten. Yeah, the Big Ten is going to be a lot tougher than the Pac-12. Not only with a lot of the teams that were the best teams in the Pac-12 over the last couple of years making the jump to the Big Ten, but also because of the teams that were already in the Big Ten that were destroying the conference. I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean like in terms of they were the big dogs of the conference. Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. So the Big Ten is going to be stacked this year. A lot of these teams that are making the jump from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten are in for a very rude awakening when they get to the Big Ten, because they're going to go from a big fish in a small pond to a medium-sized fish in a very much bigger pond. But your first one is against Northwestern. Northwestern had an out-of-nowhere good season last year. A lot of people thought they were going to be a one-win team, maybe even a zero-win team, because close to the beginning of the season they had the whole sexual harassment, ding-a-ling car wash. It's been called a very bunch of weird names on the internet, but it all refers to one thing. There was a hazing scandal going on at Northwestern. The previous head coach did nothing about it, so he was fired as soon as it was found out about. A lot of people thought they weren't going to do that well. Turns out they actually do pretty good. They have a 7-win season, which was much more than any of the previous 3 seasons they had. However, I'm concerned for a lot, not just Northwestern, but also the rest of the teams that are in the former Big Ten West. Now the divisions have gone away. Are they going to remain mediocre, or are they just going to bottom dwell in the rest of the Big Ten, while the rest of a combination of the Big Ten East teams and the Pac-12 teams that were doing real good just dominate the conference? Either way, I think Northwestern is not going to beat Washington this year. I have it as a win for Washington. Then you have your first true road game against the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Rutgers kind of dwelling around the mediocre level over the past few years. I think Washington should be able to get the win over Rutgers. So I'm predicting a 5-0 start for the Washington Huskies. But the schedule for Washington is heavily backloaded, and that toughness comes out in the very next game, which is against the Michigan Wolverines, the defending national champions. I explained in the Michigan video that I don't think Michigan is going to be as good as they have been the past couple of years because of the adjustments they have to make. But even still, I think they're like miles ahead of where Washington is right now. And even though the game is in Washington, I think Michigan pulls the game out and hands Washington what I think is going to be Washington's first loss of the year. Then you go back on the road and you play Iowa. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I believe a lot of the Big Ten West teams are going to struggle in this new Big Ten. Iowa's the exception. Iowa had a decent season last year, 10 wins, made it to the Big Ten title game, and gave Michigan quite a bit of a fight. Michigan only scored 26 points in that game, which was a lot less than most of the other games they played in. The problem was that Iowa didn't really have an offense. I think a lot of Iowa's struggles that they've had on offense in the past decade or so are going to be fixed this year. They went ahead and they finally got rid of Brian Ferentz, who was the son of the head coach. The administration finally stepped in and said, you can't keep this guy anymore. It's either you kick him out or you're gone with him. Kirk Ferentz ultimately chose to let go of his son, and so he brings in a new offensive coordinator. So I think that's going to help Iowa a lot with their offense. I don't think it's going to be near the top of the Big Ten, but I think it's improved from where it has been in the past with Brian Ferentz as their as their offensive coordinator. I think Iowa's going to beat Washington, pulling off an upset. So I think after a 5-0 start, I'm predicting that Washington loses their next 2 games, and it really doesn't get that much easier from those 2 games. In fact, I would argue it gets worse from there. The good news is that you have your first of your 2 bye weeks after the Iowa game, and then you go on the road to one of the worst teams in the Big Ten, the Indiana Hoosiers. Yeah, I just explained everything you need to know about that game. I think Washington is going to beat Indiana. going back on the winning ways temporarily. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's for long, though, because the very next game is back home, but this time against the first team you're seeing in the Big Ten on Washington's schedule that is a come over from the Pac-12, the USC Trojans. Now, the USC, kind of a disappointing year last year. A lot of people thought that USC was going to make the playoff. Instead, they went 8-5, which is disappointing for a multitude of reasons, mostly because they had Caleb Williams, who had the previous year won the Heisman as quarterback. So to go all the way to 7-5 after having playoff expectations, that's not really good. You do lose Caleb Williams. However, the quarterback did do pretty well in the bowl game. I know it was a kind of a meaningless bowl game against an inferior opponent, but I think that's a good kind of set-in game for him. I do think USC has a couple losses at that point, but that's because they have to play teams like LSU. I think USC is going to beat Washington. Look, I know we all have our concerns about USC making the jump to the Big Ten. On top of that, they have concerns about their defense. But Lincoln Riley is finally making steps to improve the defense. He went ahead and fired Alex Grinch. He's bringing in a new defensive coordinator to overhaul the defense. So I think USC's defense should improve. How much of an improvement has yet to be seen. It's not going to be seen until the season starts. But I think USC's defense will improve from the past couple years, and I think they are able to beat Washington. Then Washington has to go on the road and play Penn State. Now, Penn State, I'm going to say this, I haven't really heard a lot of people in the college football community say this, but I think it rings true. Penn State, with the state of the Big Ten right now, has to make it at least to the Big Ten title game this year to prove that it's worth keeping James Franklin. The reason why I say this, the past decade, which has been James Franklin's tenure at Penn State has only won the Big Ten once, and that was their only appearance in the Big Ten title game. They've basically been a backseat, even though they're a 10-win team constantly, they've been a constant backseat to Michigan and Ohio State. Sorry about that. But anyway, with Ohio State kind of in a desperate win-now mode, and Michigan having lost a whole bunch of pieces from last year's team, that is going to make it to where Michigan should lose quite a few games this year. I say quite a few like it isn't only 3 of them. But anyway, I think with the 2 teams that Penn State has been in the shadow of, predicted to be a little bit worse than they were last year, I think Penn State has to win, well, maybe not win the Big Ten title game, but at least make it to the Big Ten title game in order to justify keeping James Franklin in the new era of the Big Ten. If they can't, then I think Penn State's probably this is going to confirm that if James Franklin remains the head coach at Penn State, that he's going to be a backseat not only to Ohio State and Michigan, but also to Oregon and to USC possibly even as well. So to justify keeping James Franklin, I think Penn State has to at least make it to the Big Ten title game. Again, not a lot of people have said that in the college football community, but I think it rings true, especially if you're a Penn State fan. Are you comfortable with being the backseat to Ohio State and Michigan year in and year out, or do you want a coach that can bring you out of their shadow? Look at the SEC. Georgia fans, were you comfortable being a backseat to Florida and Alabama for a decade? No, you weren't. That's why even though he led you to a 10-win season in 2015, that's why you fired Mark Richt and then brought in Kirby Smart. And Kirby Smart has brought you to where you're the envied one in the SEC. It's not Alabama or Florida anymore. It's Georgia. Georgia's the team in the SEC that every SEC team strives to be, and that's because they finally kicked Mark Richt to the curb, and they hired Kirby Smart, and he's brought them to where they want to be. Penn State is basically where Georgia was 10 years ago. That team that is stuck in the mud, can't go anywhere, constant backseat to the big boys, looking for some way to get past them. If Penn State can't at least make it to the Big Ten title game this year, I see no justification in Penn State keeping James Franklin. I know that was kind of a long-winded rant there, but it rings true. But anyway, Penn State has to take advantage of a lot of openings this year, and one of the advantage they have to take advantage of is Washington having lost so many pieces this year. And I think they do. I think they are going to probably dominate Washington this year. Then Washington has to come back home to play UCLA, who is another team that is coming over from the former Pac-12. And honestly, given the position on the schedule, I think that the winner of this game is going to be who is less in the give-up mode. Both teams have lost major key pieces, especially in the head coaching department, and they also have really tough schedules. The result of this game is going to depend on which team is in less of a give-up mode. Ultimately, I think it's going to be Washington that's in less of a give-up mode, and so I'm going to give the victory to Washington there. Then you have your second bye week. Remember, the way the calendar works out this year, there's 14 Saturdays in between Labor Day and Thanksgiving Saturday. So therefore, they gave each team an extra bye week this year. You finish your schedule on the road at Oregon, who's another Pac-12 team that made the jump to the Big Ten. And Oregon, I know last year did lose to Washington in the Pac-12 title game. Washington was at its pinnacle. You had Michael Penix, you had Kalen DeBoer. This year you had neither of those pieces. A lot of your team is gone. I think Oregon, on the other hand, is one of three teams that I believe has the best possibility of making the Big Ten title game. The three teams in the Big Ten that I think have the biggest possibility of making it to the Big Ten title game are Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. I think it's going to be some combination of those three teams that's going to make the Big Ten title game this year. And especially if the Big Ten hasn't been decided yet as to who's going to make the Big Ten title game, Oregon has to beat Washington. Even if they have sealed up a spot in the Big Ten title game, it's going to be incredibly embarrassing to lose to Washington in that kind of position. I think Oregon wins. I think the combination of it being on the road at Oregon and the fact that Washington at that point may very well be in a give-up mode, that's going to lead to Oregon getting the victory. And there you go. I have Washington going from a playoff team who made it to the national title the previous year to a 7-5 team. It's nothing I really have against Washington. I just think the pieces they lost from last year, combined with the fact that they hired a unproven head coach and that they're making the jump to a much more powerful conference, that's going to contribute to Washington kind of falling from where it was last year. Maybe they build up in the future, but as for this year, I don't really have hopes for Washington. But anyway, that's it for the Washington preview and prediction video. The next one is going to be Texas. Until then, I'll see y'all later. Peace.